When using the Options API, our reactive data is traditionally tracked by our data option. And so, in this example, without doing any additional work, our count data will automatically be tracked by Vue. But when we're in the Composition API, everything is static by default. After all, this is plain JavaScript in here. And so, in order to add reactivity into our code, we need to introduce helper methods from Vue, which is a new thing in Vue 3. We'll start with the helper method, ref. To use our helper method, let's go ahead and import that from Vue. And now that we've imported our ref helper method, we can make our count reactive by passing it to the ref function, as you can see here. And just like that, our count has now become a reactive data property that Vue will track. However, something about ref, which you might not expect, is that accessing the value is a little bit different than you might expect. For example, if we had a function where we wanted to increment the count, your first instinct might be to prepend our count with the this keyword. But remember, we're in plain JavaScript, so the this context is not attached with the Vue instance, as it typically is in the Options API. And so this doesn't work. On the other hand, you might try to leave it then as count plus equals 1. But for those of us who have coded with JavaScript for a while, you'll know this won't work either because count is a constant and cannot be changed. And so what do we need to do? Well, because count is a ref, you'll need to access the value of it by adding the dot value. And when you do that, this will work as expected. It's worth noting though that you only need to do this inside of the setup function and not inside of your template. If you're feeling a little odd about this, don't worry, I have another method which might feel a little bit more intuitive. So let's talk about another helper method called Reactive. Starting over with the static count property, let's start by importing our reactive helper method from Vue. And next, we'll declare a constant called state, which will receive a reactive object. And we'll go ahead and return that so that we can expose that to the template. Inside of this reactive object, let's go ahead and now move our count directly inside of this. And now we can remove count from the returned object. And finally, since we're exporting state and not count, we'll need to now prepend our template with state dot. And with that, we now have a reactive count property. You might be wondering, what's the difference? Well, if we go ahead and look at our increment count function from earlier when we used ref, we had to use the dot value in order to access our count. But now that we're using a reactive object, we no longer need dot value. And so, we can access our count property directly with state.count, and this will work exactly as you expect. That said, some of you may immediately be thinking, "Ooh, I don't like this state prepend. After all, this means going through the rest of the template, there'll be a lot of state dot." But don't worry, I have a solution for this. So let's talk about the helper method toRefs. As we saw earlier, we now need to prepend all of our templates with state dot, and this isn't ideal. And so your first instinct might be to destructure our state object. And then as a result, you might think that we can then just say count inside of our template. However, this is not what you want to do because you'll end up removing reactivity from the different pieces inside of the object. Don't worry though, we're not stuck. As I mentioned at the beginning of this section, we have another helper method called toRefs. And this allows us to break up our reactive property. And this allows us to break up our reactive data into the individual pieces by passing it to the helper method. And now you're able to use your reactive data inside of template the way you want. Now that we understand these fundamental concepts, let's code together. To follow along, let's go ahead and check out the reactive data begin branch. And then let's open this up in VS Code. And let's open up app.vue. Inside of our file, you can see here that we have our reactive data being tracked in the data options. And so let's move that over to the Composition API. And so we'll start by opening the setup method. And so we'll want to go ahead and migrate this whole object over into our setup function. So go ahead and cut that, then we can delete this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the reactive helper method. So I'm going to go ahead to the top and let's go ahead and import that. Import from Vue. And then here, this should help us with the autocomplete, is we're looking for reactive. Perfect. And so down here now, inside of the setup function, we'll say const state equals reactive, and then I'll paste that object that we just copied over. And so you can see now here that everything has been copied over correctly. And so what we need to remember is that we need to actually return the data that we want to expose. So in this case, it would be state. But we want to also use the helper method we learned about earlier. So let's go ahead and add toRefs as well to our imports. And then down here, we'll go ahead and destructure it with toRefs. And so now everything should work as expected. And when we jump into our browser, we'll see that we have no errors inside of our console page and no errors inside of our terminal. If you want to practice creating reactive data on your own, I present you with this code challenge. Go ahead and check out the Reactive Data Challenge branch and use the Composition API to manage data inside of passwordgame.view. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to talk about computed properties inside of the Composition API.